She was 34 years old, and she had nothing left that belonged to her. Her name had been removed from the deed by a county judge who believed the word of a man over the word of a widow, and everything her late husband had built, the house, the dry goods store, the modest savings held in trust, had passed instead to her brother-in-law, Clyde Marsh, who had filed the contest papers barely 3 weeks after the funeral and smiled through the whole proceeding. She walked out of the Harlan County Courthouse in the autumn of 1887 with $41 sewn into the hem of her coat, a canvas traveling bag, and a grief so deep and particular it had no name she could find in the English language. She arrived in the small mining town of Sable Creek, Nevada, on a Thursday evening, when the light was the color of old copper and the wind came off the ridgeline with the smell of sage and iron. She had $7 left by then. The rest had gone to the stagecoach, to 2 nights in a boarding house, to bread and a single cup of coffee she had made last all morning. And in the dusty yard behind what had once been the Silver Tier Saloon, a building shuttered and half caved in since the big vein ran out 2 years prior, she found something slumped against the back wall like a tired old man who had given up on walking home. A piano, upright, weathered to the silver gray of driftwood, its keys yellowed and a few of them missing entirely. The man selling off the saloon's contents, a creditor's agent named Dooley who smelled of boot polish and impatience, told her he'd take $7 for it, just to be rid of the thing, and she stood there in the cold Nevada wind and thought that buying it was the most reckless act of her life. She bought it. And we want you to understand something. What was sealed inside that piano, hidden beneath a false bottom in the bench that had sat beneath it for over a decade, was not merely something valuable. It was something that would restore what Sable Creek had lost, redeem a promise made to the people who had built it, and bring back to the surface a justice that the earth itself had been quietly holding in trust. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Maren Elise Calloway. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, a town that time passed over, or a season of your own life where it seemed the world had moved on without you, tell us about it in the comments. You are not as alone in that feeling as you think. She had been born Maren Elise Holt in the limestone hill country of central Missouri, the second daughter of a schoolteacher named Abigail and a cabinet maker named Otto, and from each of them she had received a gift that would not become obvious to her until she was well into womanhood. From her mother she received a habit of patient attention, the ability to sit with something difficult and let it speak before she spoke back. From her father she received the knowledge of wood, how it breathed, how it held secrets in its grain, how a dovetail joint under stress would reveal which craftsman had made it by the way it failed or refused to fail. Otto Holt was not a wealthy man, but he was a precise one. His workshop smelled of cedar shavings and linseed oil, and he kept his tools hung on the wall in the shape of their shadows, so that any missing instrument was immediately visible. Maren used to sit on a tall stool in the corner of that workshop after school, doing her arithmetic while her father worked, and she would watch his hands the way other children watch card tricks, with the slow dawning certainty that there was more here than the surface showed. He taught her the names of all the woods: courtesan oak, bird's eye maple, tiger cherry, figured walnut. He taught her the difference between a joint made to be seen and a joint made to be hidden. He told her once, when she was perhaps 9 years old, and had asked why he spent so much care on the inside of a cabinet drawer that no one would ever open and admire, that the truest test of a craftsman's character was what he did when no one was watching. That sentence would come back to her many times in her life. She married at 21. His name was Robert Calloway, a serious-eyed young man from Springfield who had started a dry goods store with borrowed money and paid every cent of that loan back in 4 years, which told Maren everything she needed to know about his character. He was not romantic in the flowery sense. He did not bring her poetry or speak of her eyes like a man from a dime novel, but he was kind with a steady, habitual kindness that was far rarer and far more sustaining than poetry, and she loved him for it with the whole quiet force of her nature. They moved to Harlan County, Kentucky, in 1878 because Robert had heard the region was growing and he believed in arriving before the crowd. He was right. Within 5 years the store was prospering, and Maren ran the inventory and the accounts with the same calm precision she had once applied to her father's workshop. She kept 2 sets of books, not for any dishonest purpose, but because she had learned from Robert that a business had 2 kinds of truth: what it had done and what it was doing, and both deserved their own careful record. They had no children, which was the one sorrow she carried without complaint. Instead, she poured the energy of that unchanneled love into the town itself. She organized the lending library. She taught reading to the women at the Methodist church on Saturday mornings. She was the first person called when a neighbor fell ill or a family fell short. She did these things without announcement and without the expectation of recognition, not because she lacked pride, but because she had been raised to understand that usefulness was its own form of dignity. Robert died of a fever in the spring of 1886, quickly enough that it seemed almost inadvertent. There 1 week and gone the next, with the magnolia blossoms still on the tree outside their bedroom window. He left no formal will, because he had been the kind of man who believed he had more time, and that belief cost Marin everything he had built. Clyde Marsh was Robert's younger brother, and he had always lived at an angle to the truth. Not a cruel man, exactly, not the kind who pulled wings off things, but a man who had learned early that the world moved in the direction of boldness, and that boldness often had more to do with the volume of a claim than the justice of it. He had borrowed money from Robert twice and repaid it once, and he had the easy charm of a person who was very good at making you feel ungrateful for remembering the facts. He arrived in Harlan County 6 days after the funeral, dressed in a new coat and carrying a leather satchel, and he was at the county clerk's office before Marin had finished thanking the neighbors who had brought food. His claim was simple and, as the law then stood in that county, difficult to refute. Robert had died intestate. The property passed to blood, and Clyde was blood. Marin was a wife, but she was not a Marsh. The judge was a man who had played cards with Clyde on 3 occasions. Marin did not know this until afterward. She hired a lawyer with $40 of the money she had kept separate, kept it the way her father had taught her to keep the inside of a drawer, but the lawyer was young and the judge was not, and the hearing took less than an hour. Clyde walked out holding the deed. He had the decency, at least, to look slightly to the left of her face rather than directly at her. She did not cry in the courthouse. She cried once, that night, in the room of the boarding house where she had taken a single week's lodging, and then she pressed that grief flat like a letter you fold and put in a coat pocket, and she began to think about what came next. She had no family she could ask for help. Her mother was gone, her father's hands had given out, and he was being cared for by her older sister in St. Louis. She had $41 and the skills inside her. She chose West, because West was where a person without connections could still arrive before the reputation of their poverty. She took the stage to Louisville, then the train to St. Louis, then another train west to Reno, and from Reno, she took a stage south into the high desert because she had heard, from a woman at a boarding house who spoke with the authority of someone who had personally been disappointed by every other destination, that the silver mines in the Sable Creek district might be hiring office clerks. And Marin knew she could keep accounts better than anyone they were likely to find. But the mines, she discovered when the stage rolled into Sable Creek on that copper-colored Thursday, were not hiring. The big vein had run dry 18 months ago. Half the town had already left, and the other half had the particular stillness of people deciding whether to follow. The main street still had its buildings, but they had the feel of stage scenery, facades without much behind them. 2 saloons, 1 general store, a church, a livery, and a scattering of houses on the hillside that overlooked the creek, most of them with the windows dark. She had $7. She had no job, no room, and nowhere obvious to go. And in the yard behind the silver tier, she found the piano. Dooley, the creditor's agent, was a compact man with a mustache that seemed to require more of his attention than anything else in his life. He was moving the saloon's remaining contents into a wagon, bottles, a clock, 3 mirrors with the silver going out at the edges, and the piano was the one thing he could not lift. He had tried with the liveryman, and the liveryman had told him his back would not allow it. And so the piano sat against the back wall of the building in the cold afternoon light, and Dooley was prepared to accept nearly any offer just to have it off his ledger. $7, Marin said. She had not planned to say it. She had walked around the side of the building looking for Dooley to ask about the clock. She was thinking she might buy the clock and sell it, or find some way to transform $7 into a foothold. But when she saw the piano, something in her went still and attentive in the way her father's hands went still before he set a chisel. She walked to it and ran her palm along the top, and the wood spoke to her the way it always had. Beneath the weathering, beneath the gray and the grime, she could feel the grain of something substantial. She pressed 2 keys, and they sounded, muted and C-deep, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. 5-octave upright, Dooley said, coming around the corner with a bottle under each arm. Keys are in rough shape. Couple missing. Probably can't be tuned worth a damn. Who made it? Marin asked. Dooley shrugged. It was here when I got here. Old Fenwick Drood brought it in from Sacramento when the town was booming. That'd be 81, maybe 82. 6 years. The piano had sat in the Silver Tier Saloon for 6 years, and then another 2 years in this yard since the saloon closed. And in all that time, Marin did not think anyone had looked at it the way she was looking at it now. $7, she said again. Done, said Dooley, with a relief so thorough it was almost indecent. She paid him from the hem of her coat and walked back to the main street with nothing but the receipt he scrawled on the back of an envelope. And she felt something she could not quite name. Not joy, not hope exactly, but the specific calm of a person who has committed to a direction. The next problem was immediate and practical. She could not move the piano alone. She went to the general store, which was run by a broad-shouldered woman named Cora Petch, who had the steady eyes of someone who had outlasted a great many situations, and she introduced herself and explained what she had done. Cora looked at her for a moment. You bought Drood's old piano. I did. For $7. That's right. Cora tilted her head in the way of a person running quick arithmetic. And where are you planning to put it? Marin had not solved this yet, and she said so plainly, and something in Cora Petch's face shifted, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. Cora had a storeroom behind the shop that she wasn't using, she said, since her only employee had left for Reno 2 months ago. The storeroom had a door that locked and a potbelly stove and enough floor space for a piano and a cot, if a person didn't mind the smell of coffee and sawdust. She would take $4 a month for it. Marin had nothing left to pay her with, and said so, and Cora said she'd take it in labor, tallying stock, helping with accounts, and they shook hands on it without either of them making it sentimental. The liveryman's son, a boy of about 16 named Amos, large as a young draft horse and gentle as bread, helped move the piano that evening with a cart and what seemed like an inexhaustible cheerfulness, and by nightfall Marin was sitting on an overturned crate in Cora's storeroom with a single candle burning, running her hands over the piano in the quiet. She played it first, roughly, slowly, her fingers finding what keys still functioned, working around the gaps. She had learned piano in Missouri. Nothing remarkable, the standard repertoire of a young woman of modest means, but the playing itself was not why she had bought it. She played because it was the surest way to learn what it held. And then, as the candle burned lower, she opened the bench. The bench was the matching companion to the piano, the same silvered wood, the lid hinged at the back. She had expected to find old sheet music, perhaps, or nothing at all. Instead, she found a compartment roughly 8 inches deep filled with folded papers, and beneath the papers, a false bottom. She felt it immediately, the slight give that was different from solid wood, the telltale line of a seam that had been planed almost invisible, almost, but not quite, to a person who had grown up running her fingers along her father's joinery. She set the papers aside and pressed along the seam until she found the small, recessed catch, a notch worn smooth by someone's thumb, pressed many times before, and lifted the false bottom away. Beneath it lay a tin box, the size of a large book, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with a strip of wax that had never been broken. She did not open it that night. This surprised her later, when she thought about it. She had every right to open it immediately, and the mystery of it was the kind that made your hands want to move. But her father had taught her that the moment before you understand something is the last moment you will ever not understand it, and she had developed, over the years, a deep respect for that threshold. Instead, she went to sleep on the cot she had borrowed from Cora's spare room, with the tin box on the floor beside her, and in the morning she lit the stove and made coffee from the tin Cora had left her, and she sat with her hands wrapped around the cup and the box on the crate before her, and she thought. The piano had been brought to Sable Creek by a man named Fenwick Drood in the early days of the boom. Dooley had said 1881 or 1882. The tin box had been placed in a compartment that required knowledge of its existence. The catch was not accidental, not something a casual hand would find. Someone had built that hiding place deliberately, or had it built, and had placed the box there with the wax seal intact, and the piano had sat in the silver tier for 6 years without anyone, as far as Marin could determine, removing it. Either the person who hid it never came back, or they had come back and had been unable to retrieve it for reasons she could not yet know, or, and this was the possibility that made her hold her coffee very still, they had intended it to be found, but only by the right person at the right time. She broke the wax seal. The tin box held 3 things. First, a leather document wallet, water-stained at one corner but otherwise intact, tied with a black ribbon. Second, a folded paper map on heavy stock, the kind of durable drafting paper used by surveyors. Third, a single letter, sealed with a plain wax disc that bore the impression of a signet ring, the letter addressed, in a careful hand, to the citizens of Sable Creek whenever they are found. She opened the letter first. It was dated August 14, 1882, and it was written by a man named Cornelius Pell, who identified himself as the original founder and principal investor of the Sable Creek Mining Cooperative, a collective enterprise, he wrote, that had been established in 1879 with the contributions of 47 families who had pooled their savings, their labor, and their trust in him to build not merely a mine, but a town. He wrote with the clear, deliberate prose of a man who has thought carefully about what he is saying and is choosing every word with full awareness that he may not be there to explain it. He wrote that in the spring of 1882, he had learned that the man who had been managing the cooperative's accounts, a man named Aldous Crick, who had since departed Sable Creek with considerable haste, had been systematically transferring the cooperative's shared funds into his own private holdings. The theft was comprehensive and careful and had been accomplished over 3 years by the simple method of maintaining 2 sets of books, one for public display and one for private satisfaction. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Nevada air. By the time Cornelius Pell understood what had happened, he wrote, Crick was gone and the cooperative shared funds, a sum representing the pooled life savings of those 47 families, had been reduced to a fraction of what they should have been. Pell himself had spent the better part of 1882 trying to quietly remedy the situation, to recover the funds, to find Crick. He had failed, and his own health was failing, and in August of that year he had made a decision. He had taken the one asset that remained entirely in his own lawful control, a parcel of land, 512 acres on the eastern ridge above Sable Creek, land he had held in his own name as the cooperative's trustee, and he had converted the deed to a form of community title, a legal instrument that named the 47 founding families as collective inheritors. He had done this with the help of a lawyer in Carson City, properly witnessed and notarized. And he had placed that deed, along with a complete accounting of the cooperative's original holdings and the evidence of Crick's theft, in this tin box, sealed it, and hidden it in the piano, which he had reason to believe would outlast him, being sturdier than he was feeling. He wrote, I do not know who will read this. I know only that the land is worth more than the mine ever was, and that its worth will become clear when the silver ceases to matter and what the earth grows becomes more important than what it hides. The ridge is good land. The creek is good water. Whoever finds this, I ask only that you find a way to give it back. The deed was in the document wallet. The map showed the 512 acres in clear survey lines, the eastern ridge above Sable Creek, bounded by the creek on one side, and a stand of old ponderosa pine on the other that would have made any cattleman weep with longing. Marin sat very still for a long time. Then she opened the leather wallet and began to read the accounting. Cora Petch knew 4 of the original families. That was what she said when Marin came to her that afternoon and laid the documents on the counter and told her what she had found, her voice steady and careful as her father's chisel. Cora looked at the deed. She looked at the letter. She looked at the accounting pages, which listed names, 47 of them, with the amounts each family had contributed to the cooperative, sums ranging from $80 to $600, all of them representing years of saved labor. Cora said nothing for a long time. The Hartfields are still here, she said finally. Martha Hartfield. Her husband James was one of the founders. He's gone now, but Martha's up on the hill. The Ozark brothers. Well, just Emmett now. His brother moved to Utah. The Sang family. They're still here. Wei Sang runs the laundry. And the Delacroix family. No, they left. She paused. Most of them left. But not all, Marin said. Not all. And the ones who left, Do you know where? Cora looked at her steadily. You're going to try to find them. Cornelius Pell asked whoever found this to give it back, Marin said. I intend to do that. Cora was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, You've been in this town 4 days. 3, Marin said. Something moved across Cora's face. Something complicated, the expression of a woman who has been managing lowered expectations for long enough that unexpected good faith comes as a mild shock. Let me think on the ones who left, she said. I've kept up with some letters. And Marin, this deed needs a lawyer. A real one. In Carson City. I know, Marin said. The lawyer's fee would be another problem, and they both knew it. Marin had no money. But she had the documents, and she had the deed, and she was coming to understand this, slowly and with some wonder, something that very few people in a damaged town possessed. She had arrived with nothing to protect, and that meant she had nothing to lose by trying. The complication arrived 2 days later, in the form of a man named Garrett Soule. Garrett Soule was not from Sable Creek. He was, as he presented himself, a land agent from Reno, and he came into Cora's store on a Saturday morning with the specific kind of pleasantness that is a thin coat of paint over a harder surface. He was perhaps 50, with silver hair he wore with self-consciousness, and he carried with him an air of having arrived at precisely the right moment, which Marin recognized as the air of a man who makes it his business to know when moments are right before anyone else does. He was, he said, representing a ranching interest from California that wished to purchase the eastern ridge above Sable Creek. The land was, technically, in a state of unclear title. The original cooperative had dissolved without formal legal resolution, and in the absence of documentation, a case could be made for the title to pass to the Territorial Land Office, which was prepared to sell it. He wanted to know, specifically, whether anyone had access to the original cooperative documents. He had heard. And here his pleasantness developed a slight edge, the way bread develops an edge when it has been kept too long, that someone had been asking questions about the founding families. He looked at Marin when he said this. Marin looked back at him. She had grown up watching her father's hands move with the perfect economy of someone who has thought through every motion before making it, and she had learned from that watching to give nothing away too early. She told Garrett Soule that she was new to Sable Creek and was still finding her footing, and she thanked him for stopping in, and she sold him a tin of sardines because he asked for one, and she watched him leave with the calm attention of someone noting which way the wind was blowing. That evening, she went to Emmett Ozark, who was 61 years old and had a beard the color of iron filings and hands that had dug more silver out of the Sable Creek earth than he could ever calculate. She sat with him at his kitchen table with the documents between them, and she told him what Soule was after, and she told him what Cornelius Pell had left. Emmett Ozark read the letter twice. Then he read it a third time, and when he looked up, his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with understanding. He knew, Emmett said. Old Pell knew that ground was good for cattle. He said so when the mine was running full. He used to say we'd have another wealth on this land when the silver was done. Nobody believed him. The deed is valid, Marin said. Cora and I believe it's valid. But it needs to be confirmed in Carson City, and it needs to happen before Soule makes his move to the land office. How long do we have? Cora thinks a week. Maybe 10 days. Emmett Ozark sat with that. You're a stranger here, he said. Not unkindly. Just factually. I am, Marin said. Why are you doing this? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because Cornelius Pell hid those documents for someone to find, she said, and I found them. And because I have spent the last year watching a man who had no right to something take it anyway, and I would rather spend the next 10 days making sure that doesn't happen again than spend them doing anything else I can currently think of. Emmett Ozark looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up and went to the small shelf above his stove where he kept a tin box, smaller than Pell's, and considerably less mysterious, and took from it a quantity of bills that Marin did not count, but that was, she suspected, most of what he had. He put it on the table between them. For the lawyer, he said, and for the stage. She left for Carson City on Monday morning before Soule was awake. She had spoken to Martha Hartfield, who was 70 and walked with 2 canes, but whose mind was ablade, and who had wept briefly and silently when Marin read her the letter from Cornelius Pell, and who had signed the affidavit Marin had drafted confirming the founding family's claim. She had spoken to Wei Sang, who had read the accounting in silence and then looked at the figure beside his family's name, $220, contributed in 1879, and nodded once, with a precision that said everything. She had spoken to Emmett's neighbor, a woman named Ruth Bellow, whose mother had been one of the 47 and who still had her mother's own copy of the cooperative agreement, creased and faded, folded in a Bible. She went to Carson City with Pell's tin box, the deed, the affidavits, and Emmett Ozark's money. The lawyer she found, a woman, which surprised her, though she had no reason to be surprised, was named Frances Avery, and she had been practicing land law in Nevada for 11 years. And when she read the deed and the supporting documents, she put them down with the careful respect of someone who has just recognized something rare. "This is valid," Frances Avery said. The form of community title Pell used was recognized by the territorial legislature in 1880. "If we file this properly and immediately, before any competing claim reaches the land office, the cooperative's heirs have standing." How long? Filing takes a day. Notification of the heirs and public recording a week after that. As long as no one files a competing claim in that window. "Then we need to be fast," Marin said. Frances Avery looked at her with the level regard of someone accustomed to measuring urgency. "Yes," she said. "We do." They filed on Tuesday. Marin stayed in Carson City 4 days, in a boarding house that cost more than she liked, and she spent the days in Frances Avery's office working through the list of 47 families, cross-referencing names against territorial records, church registries, postal directories, locating heirs and descendants in Reno, in Sacramento, in Salt Lake City, in Denver. Some families had dissolved, some had multiplied. Some of the original founders were still alive, most were not, but their children and grandchildren were, and the deed named heirs explicitly. She wrote letters, long, careful letters, in her precise schoolteacher's hand, with the facts laid out simply and the copies of the relevant documents enclosed, directing each family to contact Frances Avery. Garrett Soule filed his competing claim on Thursday. Frances Avery was ready for it and had anticipated its precise legal form, and the clerk at the land office noted, with what sounded like genuine regret to Soule, that the community title had already been recorded 3 days prior. Marin was on the stage back to Sable Creek when this happened. She did not learn of it until she arrived. The town meeting was held in the church on the 3rd Saturday of October, 1887, and it was the most attended gathering Sable Creek had seen in 2 years. People came down from the hillside houses, and 2 families who had moved to the Reno outskirts came back for the day, and Martha Hartfield arrived on her 2 canes and sat in the front pew with the straightness of someone who has been waiting a long time to be able to sit straight. Frances Avery came up from Carson City and explained the legal situation in plain language. The Eastern Ridge, 512 acres of prime grazing land with creek access, worth considerably more than the silver that had ever come out of the ground beneath it, belonged, in community title, to the heirs of the 47 founding families of the Sable Creek Mining Cooperative. It could be leased to a cattle operation, managed as a cooperative ranch, or sold by collective decision, with the proceeds distributed proportionally to the families according to the original investment records. It could not be taken by a land agent from Reno. It could not be absorbed into the territorial land office's disposal inventory. It could not be won by the loudest voice or the fastest claim. It was theirs. Emmett Ozark stood up in the middle of the meeting and said, in his quiet, iron voice, that he thought they ought to vote to keep it and run cattle, and that he thought they ought to name the operation Pell's Ridge in memory of the man who had kept the faith when keeping it cost him something. Martha Hartfield seconded the motion before he had finished saying it. The vote was unanimous among the families present, and those still being contacted in other cities would, in the coming weeks, add their own assent by letter. Garrett Soule left Sable Creek on Saturday evening, and his departure was witnessed only by the liveryman and the liveryman's son Amos, and neither of them remarked upon it. Marin watched from the doorway of Cora's storeroom, her hands quiet at her sides. What happened to Marin Elise Calloway after that is worth knowing, because it is tempting to think of her as only the instrument of someone else's restoration, and she was never that. She was a person with needs and desires and a future that was still being written. The cooperative hired her, formally, with a document and a salary, to manage the accounts of what they were now calling the Pell's Ridge Cattle Association, because it had become evident to everyone involved that her particular gift for numbers and records and the keeping of two kinds of truth was exactly what the association needed and what it had, historically, lacked most catastrophically. She was paid $40 a month, which was more than she had earned since Robert's store, and she moved out of the storeroom into a proper room at a boarding house run by a widow named Esperanza Cruz who made the best red chili in the high desert and did not believe in charging for seconds. The piano went into the church, where it belonged, having already served its most important purpose. Marin tuned it herself over the course of 3 Saturdays, replacing the missing keys with pieces she carved from a strip of white ash cora found in her storage, fitting them with the patience and precision she had learned watching her father's hands. It was not a perfect job, but it was a true one, and when old Martha Hartfield sat down at it the following Sunday morning and played the opening bars of the hymn she had played at the first meeting of the Sable Creek Cooperative in 1879, the sound that came out was clear and full and whole. As for Clyde Marsh, we will not dwell on him, because Marin never did. She learned, some months later, through a letter from an acquaintance in Harlan County, that the county judge had been removed from the bench following a separate inquiry into his conduct in card game adjacent matters, and that the judgment in the Callaway estate case had been reviewed and found to have procedural irregularities sufficient to warrant a second hearing. She did not go back for the second hearing. She sent Francis Avery instead, and Francis Avery did what needed doing, and a portion of what had been Robert's, not all, not the store, which Clyde had already sold, but a portion in money, enough to matter, was returned to Marin by banker's draft on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1888. She deposited it in the Sable Creek Bank under her own name, and then she walked to the church and played the piano for half an hour in the empty building, alone with the sound she had called back to life, and she let herself feel, very quietly and thoroughly, what it was to have been right. We have told you the story of Marin Elise Callaway, who arrived in Sable Creek, Nevada, with $7 and the habit of paying attention, who bought a broken piano in a cold yard because something in her knew that does not lie about what it holds, and who found inside it not merely a deed to good land, but the fulfillment of a promise made by a good man to people who had trusted him. She had learned from her father that the truest test of character is what you do when no one is watching. Cornelius Pell had passed that test in a saloon in a boomtown in 1882, sealing his integrity in a tin box and trusting the world to send someone who would understand what they'd found. Marin had spent her life passing it, in the careful accounts she kept, in the reading lessons she taught, in the way she walked out of a courthouse that had wronged her without losing the part of herself that would walk back in and do right by strangers. We think about that sometimes, about how many promises are buried in the ordinary things the world throws away, in the pieces of furniture at the back of yards, in the buildings that sit empty and the ledgers that collect dust and the letters written to an unknown future reader who might or might not come. The world moves on and leaves so much behind, assuming it has no more value. And then someone stops and pays attention and pays $7. And the buried promise comes back to the surface, ready at last to be kept. Thank you, as always, for spending this time with us. If you've been here from the beginning, you know that these stories are our way of honoring the people history moved past too quickly, the ones whose resilience didn't make the headline but shaped the land beneath it. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who might need it today, and if you're enjoying the channel, a subscription helps us keep telling these stories as long as we can. Before you go, we want to leave you with a question to carry with you. What is something you once overlooked or let go of, a place, a skill, a piece of yourself, that turned out to hold more than you knew? Leave your answer in the comments. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.